Previously, we've spoken about the issue of how to resolve potentially ambiguous identifiers. Michael, I know, has structured this more as a workshop, sort of to figure out, to look at the problem, restate the problem, and figure out share some of the ways in which we can advance this conversation forward. Michael, I see you're on my screen. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay. So I don't necessarily want you to get your hopes up too high from Simeon's introduction. I have some suggestions to make, but I am mostly in your hands in this. It's a difficult problem. It's a problem that we've thought about for a long time. And I'm not sure that anybody really yet has a very good answer for it. But anyway, let me start by trying to sketch out what the problem is. So it's a problem that is really about identifying which DFSP to send a payment request to. There are other problems in the payment space which are about making sure that people really are the people that they say they are. The duplicate problem is not quite like that. It's to do rather with understanding which DFSP, which bank, which mobile money system we should talk to make a payment to a particular customer. Now, we do this by asking the sending customer for some information about the entity that they want to pay. And then we identify a DFSP, an account holding institution, which can recognize that piece of information. We then go directly to that DFSP and we ask if it will commit to crediting one of its customers based on that information. So let's suppose, for instance, we are looking at a phone number. We would send the phone number, we would look at the phone number and say, do we have any DFSPs who have who have registered that phone number? If they do, we contact that DFSP and say, do you recognize this phone number? If we were to send funds to it, could you make sure they were credited to the correct account? Now, the duplicate problem arises when there is more than one DFSP which recognizes that piece of information. And the problem essentially is, when there's more than one, which DFSP should we send the payment to? There is another problem, which happens if one DFSP could map that information onto more than one account. So for instance, if you imagine I've got a bank and at that bank I have a current account and a savings account. Now, it might be that if someone sent a payment to that bank, the bank might ask, well, should I put it in the current account or in the credit account? But as far as Mojulib is concerned, that's an issue for the DFSP, not for Mojulib. We're interested in establishing which DFSP we should send a payment to. Now, let me take some examples of that. For instance, let's say a customer joins more than one mobile money system. This doesn't happen much in Africa, but it happens a lot, for instance, in the Far East. In Africa, mobile money systems are generally operated by mobile network operators, by the phone companies themselves. But that's not true everywhere. And where that's the case, it's perfectly possible for a customer to join one mobile money system and then to join another mobile money system, either because she wants to replace her account or because she wants to have two accounts. So that's one example. Another example, a customer has an account at a mobile money system and an account at a bank where she's registered her phone number as an alias. So now the mobile money system has her phone number as the account identifying number, and the bank has her phone number as an alias. So both of those will register the phone number as belonging to that customer. In another instance, customer has an account at one mobile money system and her husband has an account at a different mobile money system, but they share a phone. So depending on who's using the phone, payment needs to go to a different mobile money system. Another instance, a DFSP registers a merchant and gives it a merchant code. Another DFSP registered a different merchant and registers a different merchant, but gives it the same merchant code. Now, these are quite common occurrences because people want to have short and easy to enter merchant codes, and historically it's been the case. I mean, those of you, for instance, in East Africa, will very easily recognise the situation where you walk into a coffee bar and you'll see signs all over the wall saying, if you've got an M-Pesa account, pay this merchant ID. If you've got a Tigo Pay account, pay that merchant ID. If you've got an Airtel Money merchant, and so on and so forth. So that's a very common occurrence in some parts of the world. Also, we've got a situation where, for instance, where two banks use the same core banking system. Now, core banking systems typically use elements of a customer's account number to specify what kind of account it is, for instance, whether it's a current account or a savings account, other things like that. And what that means is that the number of variants in the account number are very small, and therefore it's very common for customers in two banks to have the same account number. And unless there's some other way of distinguishing which bank you're talking about, it's hard to know who to send it to. Now, we are constantly on the lookout for examples of this kind of problem. So if any of you have any, please send them in to me, because the more examples we have, the more likely we are to come up with a solution to the problem, which will solve the maximum number of cases. So let's look now at what circumstances we're talking about. And this is a standard matrix. Down the left-hand side, we've got one DFSP or multiple DFSPs. Along the top, one entity or multiple entities. Now, on the top row, if you have one entity and one DFSP, there isn't a duplicate problem. You've got a unique match. If you have one DFSP and multiple entities which have the same code, that should never happen. That DFSP is in trouble. We need to take it to one side and say, you need to sort your life out. The problem is in the bottom row. And we have two different cases there. Where we have one entity with multiple DFSPs, then that means that essentially whichever of the DFSPs we pay, we will be paying the right person. We might not be paying the right account or the account they want us to pay, but we will be paying the right entity. So for the cases where a customer has an account at multiple DFSPs, or there are multiple customers using the same identifier. On the other hand, where we've got multiple entities at multiple DFSPs, that means we're talking about a non-unique identifier, like merchant IDs in the case that I talked about, or bank account numbers where people are sharing a core banking system. And these are slightly different from each other, at least I think in the solutions that they have. Let me ask now, who can solve this problem? Now, my answer, though I'm happy to be corrected on this, is that it's got to be the payer's DFSP or the customer who solve this problem. They are the people who are going to be sending the funds, and they are the people who will eventually be deciding where there are alternatives, which of the alternatives to choose. That in itself poses a number of further problems about how we get them this information and how they solve it. But I want to talk about some possible ideas for solving that later on. But the answer effectively is that it must be, I think, the payer DFSP. Now, we have looked in the past at things, solutions or potential solutions that say, what would happen if payee DFSPs were to register, I am the preferred target for this identifier? We've typically drawn back from that because we've said the problem is, of course, every DFSP wants to be the one that gets the funds. So how do we make sure that we are really taking into account the wishes of the customer and not simply land grabs on the part of individual DFSPs? Because we Mojaloop have historically said we don't have a direct connection with customers. We only connect with institutions, DFSPs, account holding institutions. We've drawn back from the idea of saying we ought to have something based on what the customer says about where to send something. The other problem with that is that only solves half the problem. It solves the problem where we have one customer with multiple accounts, because they can then say, well, I'm the person who should decide where that money should be going. But it doesn't offer anything as a solution to the problem. What happens where we have multiple identifiers at multiple DFSPs and they refer to different entities? I'm going to call that for short the merchant ID problem. So essentially, it's going to be the payer DFSP who solves the problem, I think. But the switch, the Mojaloop switch, I think, can help by presenting alternatives. And the integration toolkit, or similar, i.e. something which is produced by Mojaloop but sits at the customer, can also bear some of the responsibility. Now, one potential help is that some user interfaces, and I think those of you who have used mobile money systems in Africa will recognize this, is that some user interfaces require users to select the target DFSP in advance. When you select in a mobile money system that you want to send money to somewhere outside that system, they will say, first of all, typically, where do you want to send it? Do you want to send it to Tigo Pay? Do you want to send it to Airtel? And you need to choose that before you say which identifier you want to send it to. So in that case, the payer DFSP can simply route the request directly to the DFSP selected. So it would still need to make a request for resolution of the identifier, because it would still want to find out whether that was an account that could in fact receive payments. But it could route the request directly to the DFSP that was selected, and there would be no problem. Otherwise, what are we going to do? Well, the first thing we could do is collect and order duplicates. Now, at the moment, our API says when you make a request to identify a particular identifier, to say which DFSP owns it, you expect to get back one and one only. And that's the way in which the switch currently works as well. It decides which DFSP to send it to, and it sends it to that DFSP. Now, one of the things we might want to do if an Oracle returns multiple matches for an identifier is to send a resolution request to each matching DFSP. Obviously, we would discard any negative responses, any responses that said, no, this account can't receive funds, or I don't recognize it. And we would then wait until all responses have been received. We have the mechanisms for that already. We put them in place to manage the inter-scheme communications, where we wanted someone to be able to say, a DFSP to be able to say, please tell me who owns this identifier, when the identifier might be in one of several connected schemes. And their switch would need to wait for responses from a number of different possible schemes before deciding whether or not they could route the request. So that mechanism is already there. It would be relatively quick and easy for us to implement it. Then if there are still duplicates, we could apply ordering algorithms, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And then we could return all of the matches to a selection component, which I'll talk about also in a moment. I mean, these are things that they're just placeholders for ideas at the moment. So that would enable us to collect responses from all of the DFSPs who say, I recognize that identifier. Each response would have some information connected with it, which we could make use of. In particular, it would have a name. So we could, for instance, immediately distinguish whether we were talking about one entity with two different accounts at different DFSPs or two entities with obviously one account each at a different DFSP. There is also currency associated with it, so we could also retrieve information about the jurisdiction in which that account existed, which might also be of use in deciding whether or not, or sorry, which of them you wanted to route the payment to. But let me talk in the first instance about ordering algorithms. Now, we can imagine that there might be one or possibly more ordering algorithms. For instance, this is known as the Miller algorithm because it was originally suggested by Miller. Basically, it just says the latest registration is the one you probably want to send to, on the basis that people are essentially replacing accounts. So that says order in descending date of registration. Give me the latest first and then the earlier ones in sequence. We could also order according to externally expressed preference. So if there were, let's imagine, some third-party application which allowed some customers, possibly all customers, to express a preference between their accounts at different DFSPs, then an ordering algorithm could consume that information and apply it when we were actually trying to do something in the Moduloop system. But the purpose of this really is to ensure that the most likely identification is received first. We would expect that ordering algorithms should be specific to oracles, i.e. you should be able to have different ordering algorithms for different kinds of identifier. And they should be like oracles in the sense that Moduloop would provide templates for building them, but implementers could use or modify the templates or construct their own. So that would be something which essentially made it more likely, preferably certain, that the first alternative that was presented to a customer was the one that they were likely to mean. Now, let me think about what I've been calling a selection component. And the idea of this is it's something which essentially provides support to a DFSP, in this case the sending DFSP, to enable it to make good choices about which DFSP to send to. Now, I imagine this is something that could reside either at the switch or at the DFSP. And it would manage choices relating to duplicate identifiers. You remember I said that I would expect to see a number of responses to a request for account resolution in the case where there are duplicates. This then, I think, would allow a DFSP to specify, first of all, whether it will accept multiple address resolutions responses or not. If it accepts multiple responses, then you just return the multiple responses and let the DFSP sort them out, which might be a possibility, particularly for larger and more sophisticated DFSPs. If not, then the selection component would return the first response to the DFSP. And if you recall, we said we wanted that, if we could possibly get it, to be the most likely response. And then if the DFSP asks again, return the next response to the DFSP, i.e. the next most likely in a queue. So that would mean that essentially the DFSP, without needing to do anything much other more than what it does already, could say, no, I don't like that one, to give me another one. And instead of that response being routed through the system, it would just go to the selection component, which would respond from the material that it already had. Now, let's see how this might work in practice. Example 1 is where we have different identifiers. This is the merchant ID question. And here indeed is a merchant ID from M-Pesa. You'll see it's a simple 5-digit number. Customer sends that to their DFSP, and the DFSP asks the question, who owns this merchant ID? That goes to the modular loop switch, and the modular loop switch sends it to the merchant ID oracle. Oh no, it now contains duplicates, one belonging to M-Pesa and one belonging to Airtel. So now the merchant ID oracle sends one response to M-Pesa and another response to Airtel. And M-Pesa responds and says that code relates to the famous and delicious Miller's Burgers, beloved of modular loop customers throughout history. And the other one, Airtel, says, no, that refers to Matt's Pizza, delicious as well, though not of quite magnificent antiquity as Miller's Burgers. So now that information comes back to the merchant ID oracle, and the merchant ID oracle, for instance, or some similar thing could say, I can see that these have different names and therefore they are different institutions. Obviously, we would accept a degree of fuzziness in the names, but most fuzziness algorithms, I think, would see Miller's Burgers as being something different from Matt's Pizza, even though they both begin with M. So that's the first one. Now let's look at what happens with different accounts. Here, we've got a USSD session, and what that USSD session is saying is, please send a payment to this phone number. So the question now that we're asking is, who owns this phone number? Again, it goes to the modular loop switch, and now it goes to the phone number oracle. Oh no. Again, we have duplicate entries, one for M-Pesa and one for Airtel. We send out to the various the various DFSPs, as we said, and M-Pesa responds and says it's Rebecca Nyanjiga's account. And amazingly, the Airtel responds and says it's the same account. Rebecca has two accounts, one at M-Pesa and one at Airtel. And we can tell from the concurrence of the names that we are, in fact, talking about the same person. Now, let's look at how we might track and store preferences. Now, in the current structure, there are two things that we don't have. First of all, I'm going to rephrase that. We don't have a way to tie a request for the agreement of terms to the address resolution request, which may have preceded it. And that's partly because we don't insist that an address resolution request should precede a request for the agreement of terms. If a DFSP already knows who owns a particular account, it can send an agreement of terms without needing to get a address resolution first. Now that may fail if the account has been suspended or closed, but nevertheless, they can do it if they want to. We also, and this is more problematic, I think, we don't have any way of understanding which customer issued an address resolution request. Now, what I said is the question of which DFSP to send a payment to is not a question that can be answered in general. Different customers, different senders might have different answers to the question, who should I send this payment to? Which entity should I send this payment to? If I happen to be in the lucky situation of being just around the corner from Miller's Burgers, I'm almost always going to want to have that merchant code interpreted as a Miller's Burgers merchant code. Whereas my good friend who has the equally good fortune of living just around the corner from Matt's Pizza will always say, no. As far as I'm concerned, that ID means Matt's Pizza. Now, What that means, I think, is that we would need to know, in order really to be able to store and track and store preferences, we would need to know which sender we were talking, which sender's preferences we were talking about. But if we could do that, we could build an ad hoc system for tracking customer preferences in relation to accounts. Now, that's a different thing. Whether it's a more valuable thing or not is a question that I leave for you to decide, and maybe we could have a quiz about it. But nevertheless, it does mean that we are now tracking user preferences and user habits rather than allowing receivers to say, please send here or here. Now, how might something like this work? Well, if we were using ISO 20022, we could add an endpoint which included a request for address resolution. Now, that would allow the payer DFSP to identify the customer who's asking for resolution of the address. Obviously, we would need to extend the FSP IOP API, our existing API, correspondingly. And when we receive a request for the agreement of terms, this is really an assertion that says, for this customer, DFSP Y is the correct assignment of identifier Z. So effectively, to have a customer say, I want to send funds to this identifier at this DFSP, could be taken to mean, and perhaps in a world like this should be taken to mean, as far as I'm concerned, DFSP Y is the correct home of identifier Z. And if we store this assertion, we could use it as input to the selection or the ordering component. And that would increase the chances of the user getting the right DFSP first time, which would certainly be useful in cases where DFSPs weren't offering resolution of multiple DFSPs. But it would also allow them to change their mind if they want to. So a customer could reject an initial identification, say, I don't want that, in which case they'd get the next one in the queue. And the next time they made a request for agreement of terms, their preference would change. We could get quite sophisticated with that, but we wouldn't have to. Now, the question with multiple returns is who signs? Now, at present, the creditor DFSP signs the response, an address resolution response, and that means I warrant that I do hold an account corresponding with the identifier you said and that it can receive funds. Now, if we are returning multiple responses, we've only got one space for a non-repudiation signature, the signature that says, I promise that this is good information. Now, possible solutions are the switch could sign the composite response, the switch could compose the response and add the signatures received into the signature field as well as signing the whole message. Or for ISO 20022 messages, the business application header for that message can include multiple copies of what's called a related element. And each related element is a business application header with a signature. So we could include the business application headers of the component messages and their signatures. I started off in this life not being too impressed with ISO 20022. But the longer I spend, I'm really suffering from institutional capture because I find things in ISO 22 and I think, oh, that's a good thing. I'm glad they included that. So that probably shows I should be taken off the ISO 20022 watch forthwith and put out to grass. Now, how would the payer choose? Switch returns multiple responses in the agreed format. But in the end, those can only be actioned by the user interface of the sender DFSP, the payer DFSP. So either the DFSP will have to modify its UI to allow the choice to be made, for instance, by saying, do you want to send to Miller's Burgers or to Matt's Pizza? Or it will feed the result to the DFSP one at a time. And if the DFSP resends a request for the same identifier, the selection component either responds with the next item in its list or with a not found, pardon me, if there aren't any more items. So that would work, I think, reasonably okay. So let's look at how this might work in practice. Here's our merchant ID again. And here we are sending a request to say who owns it. It goes to the switch, to the merchant oracle. It goes to the two DFSPs who own that identifier. And now one comes back and says Miller's Burgers, the other comes back and says Miller's Pizza. They both now go to a component in the switch which composes a response. And that produces a composite response, which says we have two items, either Miller's Burgers or Matt's Pizza, with different DFSPs, but the same currency. And this now goes back to a selection component. The selection component removes one of the responses and sends it back to the payer DFSP. Payer DFSP, let's suppose, likes that one. It's from me, and I'm around the corner from Miller's Burgers, and it sends a request for agreement of terms to Miller's Burgers. Now we can store the preference for that customer, and the next time it comes round, we can make sure that that one is the first in the list. And the selection component then forwards it to the Mojolip switch in the normal way. When we come to reuse the selection component, we can see that the payer DFSP asks the customer, is this correct name? And it asks by putting something on the phone, do you want to pay Miller's Burgers? Customer says, no, it's not. So now the payer DFSP, the customer's DFSP, sends out the same request as before. Who owns this merchant ID? But it's picked up by the selection component, which says, oh, okay, I've got another item in the queue. It's Matt's Pizza. I'll try that one. So now, without the payer DFSP having to behave in any way differently from the way it behaves today, it can get a list of possible alternatives and can ask its customer, again, using the same interface as today, which of them it should choose. So that is all that has passed through my diseased imagination between the last time we talked about this, which was quite a while ago now, and now. I have to, I should say, before I throw the floor open for debate, I should apologise for not having done anything more before now. I can only plead that there were other things in the way. However, does anyone have any questions or any points that they would like to raise about this? Aha, I can see a queue of people with their hands up. I'm going to go. Oh, Miller, you have your hand as a yellow hand. Does that mean you raised it first or second?
Well, that means I'm using the default.
Okay.
Which is somewhat, if not ironic, at least a bit sarcastic. So a couple points. One in particular, the example you've given, which is helpful, I think, in looking at how would we resolve duplicates if they were to exist. I just want to make one point, which is this will never arise for merchants. It can't. This is just too dangerous for the system, and the scheme will have to resolve this. What we've seen is the two different resolution methods both of which are okay. I think one is better than the other, my opinion. In one case, both cases use a central merchant registry. And so when you put in the merchant ID, it will find in the central merchant registry one and only one association to that merchant ID. That merchant ID, when you first bring the system up, will adopt as best it can the existing till numbers that were issued in the non-interoperable closed loop systems, but it may do one of two things. Either require the non-majority player to adopt the majority player's numbering system, or it will have a DFSP prefix added to the merchant ID, in which case they're essentially automatically self-selecting and self-non-duplicated. So in that case, and I think if there's somebody from Wired In or from RSwitch on, they can speak to their solution here, but I think it builds on that idea. So you're in essence saying my till number is magical prefix followed by a possibly duplicate merchant ID. And the reason that we have the merchant ID duplicates, and that why you're choosing this very excellent example, is that if you have a majority player in the market, you'd be dumb as the minority player to give a different till number to that customer if you could simply use the same one. So customers only had one thing to remember. And if they're paying with Airtel, they get the Airtel merchant ID. If they're paying with M-Pesa, they get the M-Pesa one. The problem exists if you try to migrate that into this new interoperable world. And so I would have said that the solution is the central merchant registry, and it's the central merchant registry's problem to make them unique, either through the reassignment of values to the minority players as they onboard to the new system, or by the use of a prefix. The only reason I think the former is better is it drives portability. That says that I can switch at any time. My number comes with me. But in the case of the using the prefix up front, your till numbers are going to change if you change your provider. Sorry, if you change your as a merchant, change your provider. So let me just pause there though, because I think that was the primary issue here. But I do think that there's another thing to discuss, which is that having the payer decide which account money goes into, that's a huge privacy problem for me. I would never want that. Disclosing me as the payer to the payee is also a privacy problem that we want to be careful that we also have to manage. So I think there are other unstated issues here, but I'm glad that you kind of went through this in mathematical completeness to show what the issues were.
Thank you. James.
Yes, thanks, Michael. I was just wondering, how much of a pressing problem do we think this is? I know we have adoption projects running fast and furious everywhere. I don't think we've encountered this yet in the field. How likely are we to trip over this in the coming months? How much effort and focus do you think we need to give this in the short term, medium term, and straight long term? When do we need some hard and fast solutions by?
So my answer is we have already run across it. We run across it with WinePay.
Okay, what did we do there?
Because in Far Eastern situations like Myanmar, it's very common for people to belong to more than one mobile money system. And therefore, when you're trying to pay somebody via a phone number, you have to figure out which of the mobile money systems you should actually be paying.
So can we clarify that, Michael, that it's not mobile money? I think that's what's confusing people. It's banks or MFIs. Mobile money requires a SIM card. There's a one-for-one association, unless you're Alipay or Tencent, which are different situations. But what we're saying when it's a telco-associated mobile money, it's always associated the SIM, the MSI-SDN, by definition, is unique. So this problem doesn't really arise there. The problem arises as soon as you throw a bank or something like that into the mix. where they don't issue the phone number, and therefore now they're stuck using one that you already have that might be associated with a telco-related mobile money account. Over.
Yeah, but those are, I mean, you're right. For MNO operated mobile money systems, it's not a problem. And I think I said that earlier on in the presentation. Okay. But the problem is that there are jurisdictions, and quite a lot of them, which do not require mobile money companies to also be MNOs, that companies that are regulated in the same way as MNO-based mobile money companies, but do not themselves issue phone numbers and SIMs, are perfectly legitimate in lots of jurisdictions, and that includes Myanmar. So it's not the case, for instance, that these are banks which are using aliases, using Muslims as aliases for their customers. They are genuine mobile money companies, but they exist in a jurisdiction which doesn't require them also to be MNOs. So, yeah, so my answer is we have already run across that. It was a problem relating to mobile money companies, though it wouldn't matter if it had been a problem relating, for instance, to a combination of MFIs and mobile money companies or whatever. Now, that's not to say it's not a problem we can work around, as indeed we did for WinePay. Or indeed, as Miller suggested, for instance, by prepending a magic number that says this merchant ID belongs to this DFSP. The question is, can we find a way, a general way, for a system like ours to say to people who have this problem, this is how we recommend you solve it or avoid it? Now, I entirely agree with Miller that a lot of this can be done in scheme rules. But that doesn't mean that all of them, and where it can be done in scheme rules, it should be done in scheme rules so that the problem does not arise. But if there are cases, if there's still legitimate use cases where it might still arise, then I think that it behoves us at least to be thinking about how we might solve it.
Yeah, it would seem that the scheme design itself has to take into account the local context and what's permitted. Mm-hmm. The design of UPI from the beginning was set up to require unique aliases because it recognized this problem. The other issue is when you start introducing PISP, where the payment initiation service provider now has to indicate a very strange situation where they could say that the sender and the receiver have the same phone number. And that would be weird, but it could arise. So there has to be a uniqueness quality to the IDs, or they don't serve as IDs. And I think how you go about figuring that out is the nature here. And what you're saying in the presentation is, if you were required to manage the non-uniqueness of IDs, how would you go about doing it? And I think it's useful, and you've done a really good job, I think, of going through all of various different alternatives. There may be others, and I think to James's point, it's a question of whether we address this now, midterm, or later. At the same time, if we have an active problem, for example, in Myanmar and others, where they want to use the phone number, can they deal with this at the scheme rules level or through the merchant registry level for merchant IDs? Or must there be some other strategy for doing that? That could be the focus of the conversation at that level. I don't think it's preference. I think the preference is to use unique IDs, and that you specify in the scheme rules how you go about doing that. It may be a prefix. It may be that there's some other strategy for that. I think the way UPI work, maybe somebody here who has a UPI account can comment on it. I believe that the alias is coded in such a way that the provider is included as part of the alias in some fashion. I don't recall exactly the details.
That is correct.
And that makes them unique. Yeah.
Yeah. There is a suffix with the provider's ID at the end.
Mm-hmm. So I think in that case, it doesn't. This wouldn't arise. They're essentially saying they are unique. You could pick anything you'd like. However, we're going to pick the second part. That's not up to you. So you're going to be, Mumble at Airtel versus Mumble at M-Pesa, and you can still be referred to people, pay me at Mumble, but that's not enough. You have to specify the full alias. I mean, that's a little bit awkward in some ways, but you've got to have some strategy, I think, for deduping this that isn't going to require the elaborate algorithms that may be difficult for people to follow or that have privacy disclosure issues with them in the way that they operate. But those would be considerations. I'm not trying to shut down the discussion, though. I want to be sure that we have an opportunity to go through that, but that we're open-eyed about some of these other factors.
Sure, I mean, for instance, it was one of the problems that they had in the Tanzania implementation. That was a question relating to duplicate bank accounts. And they proposed a similar solution to the UPI one, that is to have, in this case, a prefix that said this bank, this account number. But it was essentially thrown out by the banks, who said we would have to do so much work in order to implement it, and you couldn't implement the entire system for several years. I know that's banks for you, but
well, I'm going to push back on that, because it's not, the banks will never see anything but the account number. The prefix is peeled off as part of the routing. That's the whole point, is that you look at that just as they do in UPS. The at part that is which DFSP it goes to is unimportant to the provider. You know that was in the provider registry. That it's the account number portion that is the part that you forward. And same thing with banks. They didn't have to forward the entire thing and have the bank try to figure out how to peel off the prefix or figure it out that way. They could do it at the system itself. So when they're doing the ALS request, you take the prefix off and you use that to tell you where to send the request. All that goes across is the account number. Same thing with LEIs. If you really needed to do that, you could, but you shouldn't, because they're unique.
Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you what happened.
I know, I get it. I'm just saying, I don't want to look at the sort of misdirections from things they decided didn't work, but could have what I would call fairly straightforward resolution. We should look at both of those things. Do I need a resolution? If so, is there one? Anyway.
Thank you very much indeed. If anybody has any ideas, questions, or anything like that, please get in touch with me. This is a subject, as you can tell, that I'm interested in. I don't always get enough time to devote to it. So please get in touch with comments, suggestions, and so on. And I now hand you back to the safe hands of Simeon.